There once was a learned and well-respected Buddhist monk by the name of Rishi who resided in a little village in a far-off area of the nation. He was well known in the hamlet for his extensive understanding of the Dharma and his capacity to lead others toward enlightenment. Over the course of his many years of travel, Rishi met a wide variety of individuals and gained invaluable life lessons from each one. He had been teaching and propagating the teachings of the Buddha for many years. A young guy by the name of Tom approached Rishi one day while he was dozing down beneath a big Bodhi tree. Tom had heard a great deal about Rishi's vast and deep knowledge. He then made the decision to see Rishi in order to receive solutions for the issues he was having in his life. Tom worried a great deal about his life and the real people, the individuals he was spending his precious time with were not able to provide him happiness or serenity. He was so resolved to seek the Buddhist monk's guidance on the route to genuine pleasure and joy in order to learn anything from him that may transform his life. With a kind grin, Rishi greeted Tom and asked him to take a seat close to him. Tom revealed everything about the folks who never valued him and thought of him as a piece of trash once he arrived. He begged Rishi to explain to him how he would be able to recognize the real and authentic individuals. In an attempt to ease Tom's inner suffering, Rishi began telling him a tale about the 5 kinds of people he should never associate with or avoid in order to have a happy and peaceful existence. There was a young guy by the name of Eric. He had many of friends and lived in a busy city. He used to relish every moment he spent with them. He delighted in spending time with them and participating in different activities. But as time went on, he began to realize that some of his pals were having a bad effect on him. The gossipers were the first group of people Eric knew he should keep his distance from. This friend would constantly start rumors and foster negativity throughout perfect conversations. Eric discovered that any time he was around this individual, his head would fill up with a lot of destructive and pointless ideas. He so decided to steer clear of this friend and began concentrating on developing a good rapport instead. Eric made the decision to stay away from criticism as the second kind of people. This friend was often criticizing other people, pointing out their flaws and attacking his behavior. Eric quickly came to the conclusion that his outlook on life was being negatively impacted by this persistent pessimism. He was aware of the value of surrounding himself with positive and inspiring individuals as opposed to those who would constantly criticize and bring him down. Eric made the decision to keep his distance from manipulators as the 3rd kind of people. This acquaintance had a knack for manipulating events to further their own agenda, frequently at the expense of other people. Eric saw that he would always feel exhausted and exploited after spending time with his friend. He made the decision to put his personal well-being first and break go of the friendship after realizing how toxic it was. Envious people were the 4th kind of people. Eric came to the realization he had to let go of. This friend was insecure and jealous of other people's achievement because he would continually compare himself to them. Eric realized that recognizing and valuing the accomplishments of others is the path to true happiness. He understood that he could cultivate a spirit of thankfulness and satisfaction by surrounding himself with people who encouraged and supported him. The naysayers were the 6th person Eric finally recognized he needed to let go of. This acquaintance would constantly question Eric's capacity for dreaming, throwing doubt on his goals and objectives. Eric understood the value of surrounding himself with individuals who shared his vision for the future. He came to see that he could cultivate his own self-belief and accomplish good and great things in life by surrounding himself with positive and supporting people. With a thoughtful ear, Tom heard Rishi conclude the tale. He saw the value of the monk's advice and realized how important it is to make intelligent friendship choices. He expressed his gratitude to Rishi for his teachings and enlightenment and promised to think about the 5 kinds of individuals he should cut ties with in order to live a happy and fulfilled life. Tom started a voyage of self-discovery and personal development that day. He carefully assessed his connections, trying to foster those who inspire and provide positive vibes while progressively removing himself from those that stood in the way of his advancement. Tom eventually discovered that he was surrounded by a group of people that encouraged him and shared his ideals. The story of Rishi and Tom serves as a reminder to all of us in our own lives to be mindful of the types of people we surround ourselves with by letting go of the gossipers, the critics, the manipulators, the envious, and the doubters. Together, they walked the path of righteousness, helping and encouraging one another along the way. We make space for good influences and foster an atmosphere that has a positive, life-altering effect on each of us. May we all have the fortitude to make intelligent friendship choices and pursue enlightenment and real happiness. Tom's self-discovery quest led him to become increasingly attentive to Rishi's teachings. He understood that developing good traits inside oneself is the key to achieving actual pleasure and fulfillment, in addition to selecting the appropriate friends. Tom tried to live his life as an example of compassion, kindness, and awareness after being inspired by the monk's teachings. He gave his all to the practice of meditation in order to expand on his comprehension of what genuine bliss and tranquility are. He was now using these activities to find himself within himself. Tom experienced a deep feeling of clarity and inner serenity. Tom once saw a beggar sitting on the side of the road while passing through a nearby village. The beggar looked to be oppressed and was unkempt. Many others walked by him without giving him a second look, but Tom's kind heart begged him to stop and help him. Tom asked the beggar how he was doing and how he could help him as he walked up to him, grinning warmly. The beggar was taken aback by the charity, since he was not used to receiving it. After a brief pause, he replied, "I have nothing but the clothes on my back. I have nowhere to stay and am really hungry." With a nod, Tom said, "Don't worry, I'll try my hardest to provide you with what you truly require." In response, Tom reached inside his backpack and took out some tasty food for the beggar. This was the food he had thoughtfully prepared for his gradual self-discovery journey. He gave the meal to the destitute beggar, who took it with gratitude. Then, in an effort to keep the beggar warm in the early frigid weather, Tom handed him his cloak. The begging man was touched to tears by Tom's kindness and charity. "You've been good to me when no one else has," he remarked. "You do this, but why?" Tom grinned and answered, "I have discovered through studying the teachings of Buddha that genuine happiness stems from altruism and compassion, assisting those in need. I nurture delight inside myself and spread goodness throughout my surroundings." The beggar gave Tom a grateful hug, tears welling up in his eyes. The beggar promised himself that day to turn from his evil habits and pursue a life of goodness. Therefore, the tale of Rishi and Tom is a timeless reminder that we can have a significant effect on both our own lives and the lives of people around us, if we choose our companions carefully, develop positive traits within ourselves, and embrace compassion and kindness. May every one of us aspire to be the finest version of ourselves, treading the moral high road and imparting knowledge and love wherever we go.